Hi, and welcome back. If you remember last time, we were talking about Van Gennep's rites of passage. We argued that there were three phases to every important ritual: separation, transition, and reincorporation. We were using baptism as Christianity example. Let's do one with weddings, which is much more clear here. What do we call somebody who is not married, who's never been married? We call them single, right? Now, in that state, they're kind of separate. Right? What happens what do we call people who are planning to get married but have not yet married? What status are they? They're not really single, right? And they're not married yet, are they? They're between statuses. How are they between? Well, they're single but not becoming something else, a couple, right? But they're not yet or they're a couple, but they're not yet a married couple, right? And we call those obviously fiancé, right? Fiancé. So we even have a name for it, and that is between statuses. Right? When do you become reincorporated? You become reincorporated when you got married. Now you're husband and wife. Don't they say at the end of the ritual, I now pronounce you husband and wife? Has your status been changed? Yes. Okay. It's been exchanged both in terms of a psychological state, also in terms of now a legal state. You with me? Let's take death. Separation, transition, reincorporation. When someone dies, what do we call the body? Corpse. Okay. What is a corpse? It's a dead person. But it's more than just a dead person. What is it? It's a dead person who hasn't been buried. When you're a corpse, you're between status. You used to be living, right? Now you're not living. Right? But you're not buried. Right? What do we talk about people who are related to the corpse or this deceased? Mourners. Mourners is in between status. Right? Before that, you weren't mourning. Now you're mourning. How long will mourning last? It depends. In some cultures, it lasts a week. In some, it lasts 45 days. In Imperial China, it lasted 3 years. Right? And how long it was, is you're always in mourning. You're always between statuses until the culture says, now that you've done this ritual, you're no longer a mourner, a sociological mourner. I've noticed in America and Christian religions, lots of people take the body to the cemetery as a group, and then everyone returns for a party. And at that point, they're no longer officially in mourning. The mourning period is over. The next day, they will not wear a black tie. Right? They will not be wearing any clothing that suggests that. They are no longer sociologically mourned. They've been reincorporated into society. Now, that saying it does not mean that each individual, depending upon their attachment to the deceased, does not continue to experience grief. Clearly they do. What it does mean is, and hit the point, so individually you can still continue to experience grief, but from a sociological point of view, you no longer are publicly declaring yourself, I'm in a public state of mourning. Okay? And there, notice you ever go to the casinos? Sure you do. And you ever see those people in those white wedding gowns? It's kind of odd, isn't it? As you know, Vegas is the marriage capital of the world. Why is it odd? It's odd to you. It might be nice to you. Nobody looks at it as a bad thing. But why is it odd to you? Because you're confronting somebody wearing all the gowns of being in a state of transition. And that creates kind of like, how should you greet the person? Has the wedding taken place yet? Is it after the wedding? And this person really is kind of delaying the part because she's already announcing herself by wearing this bridal stuff and walking through the casino. Says, hey, I've on my way to get married. In most cases, it's I've already been married and we're on to the reception, and I want everyone to say, oh, you're married, right? How do you know you're married? What's the biggest thing that changes your role? You go through this ritual, you say husband and wife, but how do you begin to really internalize you're married? How about you? If the people taking this class have been married, what took place that really started to sink in that, hey, I'm married? You know what it was? Your ring. you would meet a stranger and they would say, "Oh, you're married." And you would think, "Yeah, I am." And so slowly you'd be wearing signs, symbols, to communicate to other people to treat me as my new social status. In time, you will internalize that identity. So there we see ritual functioning to facilitate people moving into a social arena, also facilitating and preparing people to change a psychological orientation. Let me tell you very quickly, and it's very fascinating, of a large study that I've done in Las Vegas with a fellow UNLV student on spousal exchange. Many cultures engage in spousal exchange. It has not been studied very much at all. In Vegas, there's been a number of little pop studies on the American swinging thing, which is just our word for spousal exchange, and it creates all sorts of ambivalence. I was really interested in this because part of a larger project of mine, what is the relationship between sex and love, and I wanted to know, are people in Las Vegas who engage in spousal exchange, are they capable of love? Are these dead marriages, and this is just another way of getting an outlet release, right? There's a certain psychological type go to this. And so I interviewed lots of people about their marriages, about their feelings for their spouse. And I became absolutely convinced that these people had great feelings for their spouse. So that raised an interesting question. If you have great loving feelings for your spouse, how are you able to maintain the sense of challenge to your marriage by engaging in sex with people you're not married to? And I was just extremely puzzled by this. And then it hit me that what is going on here is their ability to engage in ritual. And to sustain that ritual helps sustain their psychic orientation to one another and not fly into space. Spousal exchange, as it's practiced in America, is not open marriage. Open marriage essentially says we're married, but we won't wear anything to announce to other people that we're married, and we will just go about our own lives. I don't own you, you don't own me, and we will go about our lives and enjoy the bounty of variety. Okay? We know that everyone who practices that always breaks up. It does. There's no rituals to bring you back as a couple. You act as an independent agent. You fly into space as an independent agent. So why doesn't that happen to swingers? Why do many swingers be married 8, 15, 30 years? How can this be when they're breaking the fundamental charter of a marriage, that is sexual exclusivity? Okay? Puzzle. I should say I'm doing a paper on this that I've never engaged in spousal exchange, but the co-author of the paper has been very active, and that's important because without her contribution of what actually takes place, I would have never really understood this. I had thought that people went to parties and then just went their own separate way. In fact, what people do is they bring the marriage right into the swinging encounter. Their people have to talk about it. They have to be in agreement. What are they doing? They're acknowledging that you own my body. I own your body. Will you allow me to sleep with this person? I don't know. If you do, will you allow me to sleep with that person? It's almost like Battlestar Galactica, by your leave. Okay? This is a little social ritual that's known to the couple. But couples do something else. Before they go to these outings, each others become incredibly attentive to one another, picking out clothing for one another, thereby saying that I approve of this, I support this. They'll talk about who they want, who they don't want, and letting know there might be an exchange. Okay? They're constantly observing one another, and therefore making sure this has nothing to do about feeling, it only has to do about sex. And then this becomes important. Remember Van Gennep, separation, transition, that when they leave, they're reincorporated by celebrating coupleness. They become incredibly focused on one another after the event. They become almost trying to rejuvenate or reassure one another that this was just a sexual exchange, that is an exchange of body fluids and nothing more. And what I realized in looking at this, the way this works for these people, and the work is that they don't divorce, they do have feelings for one another. The way this works for those people who choose to do this activity is that they, without thinking it through, have created on their own a tightly bound ritual process that celebrates their marriage. And that is why it's been able to pull it out. I illustrated here, besides giving you a peek into spousal exchange, and I should say this, the little bit that's been written on spousal exchange, and it's been very little, but if you take Eskimos, they follow the exact same procedures that the American swingers do. Never read on each other's, never saw one another, but on their own and trying to maintain the pair bond marriage while engaging in this other, they wound up celebrating or reinforcing their commitment to one another. What's the point here? Remember my earlier observation. Ritual is critical for sustaining social boundaries. And if you're having trouble making friends, I would say to you, you are a bit of a cultural dope. And I don't mean that insulting. What I mean is you haven't quite got the culture right, or you are too proud to engage in these little ritual acts that seem to be so critically important for taking an isolated self and making it merge into something larger. Okay? Let's take Victor Turner. Victor Turner was an American anthropologist who was working with Wangenep stuff, and he just moved on ritual to a notion of communitas. And he said that when we move from individuals into larger groupings, we have this rush of connection, the self merging with something larger. And that state he called communitas. It's his word. It's not a bad word. If you think of a really good football game where you're out in the crowd and all of a sudden you feel more connected as you're charging for your team, or it could be basketball. If you go to a concert that you all happen to let go and everyone feeling really around that, you feel that somehow these strangers you share something with. Turner, in writing this up, really was focusing on pilgrimages, how pilgrimages came together as a group and felt the sense of communitas. There's lots of departments, lots in Japan, but particularly in America too, try to have retreats where people come together as a very important group and feel wonderfully connected. It's something unique about humans is that going through this ritual process, you feel reconnected in a transcendental way, and thereby celebrating another dimension of your humanness. If we have more time, I'll talk about structure and anti-structure at the end of this lecture. So let's go on to something else here. What I want to do now is go on to evil. I want to talk about witchcraft. I want to talk about comparing shamans with priests. Let's start off with evil. And we'll be ending this lecture today on evil, but just to tease us a little bit. There's two giant traditions in the world that you can classify evil. Is evil one force moving out, or is it a dual force? That is, it's in the person and also outside the person. Right? In Christianity, we look at the devil. How? Okay. These days we look at the devil as this force, this entity force that somehow disrupts relationships, disrupts our relationship with God. But did you know in the early Christian religion, Satan was looked as the test of your commitment to God? So Satan had a role. His role was to give you challenges, and your role was to meet those challenges, thereby proving you were in the service of God. Take the book of Job. If you remember in the book of Job, there's an argument or a discussion with Satan and God and over faithfulness and loyalty. And Satan says, I can make somebody doubt your existence. And God says, go ahead. And so Job loses all of his animals, then loses all of his children, and he's in with boils and diseases over his body. And at this end, this faithful worshiping soul looks up to the heavens and just says, why? Why me? Remember we talked, one of the things of all religions has to address the problem of suffering, theodicy, the problem of suffering. And God gets, remember it's the Old Testament God, not the New Testament God. And God says, who the hell are you to, in so many words he says, who the hell are you to ask why? Your job is just to worship me. And then being beneficial, he gives Job back everything that he had lost. Point of the story is that Satan tests your relationship to God. This changes in Christianity, where the notion of the devil becomes not someone whose role is just to test, but it's to disrupt and transform completely. Hebraites were very interesting. They originally, like many cultures, looked at evil as outside the group. It was an outside thing that was affecting the souls of people in this community. In the transformation of the devil or Satan, Satan now is inside the community. It can be outside and it can be inside. And this now means is that people look human, but they might not be human. Okay? It raises the question of evil in the sense that, is it innate as a fundamental feature of the human being to be wrong, to do wrong? Let me back up. We all make mistakes, and some of the mistakes have some kind of nasty consequences. It's not clear to me that most of the people who do these things are evil people. Okay? That is that given the opportunity, they would just hurt. They did something that might have hurt someone, but it might have only been that time. You with me? Our conception of evil, though, in the sense that it could be laced through an entire character, and if you get little glimpses, these little glimpses of what you really are about, it's not an accident. It's your essence of your soul which is dark. It's peculiar to Christianity. Most cultures in the world give people a lot more slack than we do. Most cultures in the world realize that life is complicated. Sometimes you do stuff that harm people. You have consequences, but you're not an evil person. You're not a terrible person. And once you've rectified those consequences, most people allow you back into the group because you are a regular Joe who just made a mistake and you made up for it, no big deal. But we have a sense is that you've not only made a mistake, you've left the group completely. And if you're locked back in, you're kind of like a pariah in a certain sense. And what this really is really marking a strong Christian. Even if you're no longer a Christian, you carry this notion of evil with you in a certain way. Let's go to witchcraft and move this anthropologically, cross-culturally. Many cultures have a notion of witch. What's a witch? A witch is someone who intentionally, and in some cultures, unintentionally, causes harm. Right? And these are the people you have to watch out for. Remember we said the problem of religion is to explain, one of the issues of religion is to explain not only the origins of a group and the purpose of life, but also why people suffer. Okay? Witchcraft is part of also that explanation. Why did misfortune happen to me? Somebody doesn't like me. Somebody is against me. So we look for evil agents that can be intentional or unintentional. Excuse me. Let's take the Azante. The Azante are in the Sudan, southern Sudan. They are a kingdom state, agricultural people, complex government. And they believe everything in life is caused by witchcraft. Okay, everything. For example, the anthropologist, the famous Evans Pritchard, was sitting with the Azante, and the farmers, they have these big grain storages made out of wood, and all of a sudden you'd hear, boom, right? And they would look at it and say, witches. And Evans Pritchard would say, what do you mean? He'd say, somebody just hexed me, and that's why my grain thing just collapsed. And Evans Pritchard would look at him and say, your granary's full of termites. Termites eat wood. That's why it fell. That's nothing with witches. Termites eat wood. Wood collapses. And you know what the Azante said to that? They looked at him and said, how stupid. Of course termites ate it. But why did mine fall right now? His across the way has termites. His doesn't fall. Mine fell not because of termites, because of witchcraft. Going along on a trail, you slip and fall. Your shotgun goes off, hits a rock, hits a limb, falls down, and breaks a guy's hand. Why? Accident. Why did you trip? Every day you go down that trail. Why did you trip this day? It's very rare to hit a rock, hit a tree, to break a lamp. Witches. Everything in the Azante worldview is caused by witchcraft, either intentional or unintentional. There are no accidents. There are absolutely no accidents. It's all caused by that. Take, for example, today. What type of weather do we have? I don't know. I'm in the studio. Let's look outside. Let's say if it's sunny. Why? If I was in Azante, I would say, witches. Now, you would look smuggling to yourself and go, oh, just trying to make a teacher's point. I'm saying, no, actually witches. You'd say, look, there's a high pressure point over it. Or if today's raining, since this will be shown at different times, you would say there's a low pressure point that's pushing the clouds in. And I would say to you, as an Adzante would say, of course a high pressure point came in. Of course there's clouds or no clouds. But what caused the high pressure point to come? There wasn't a high pressure point a couple days ago. Why did it all of a sudden occur today? Witches. Okay. And why are you not taking good notes? Witches. It's not your fault. Someone doesn't like you. What's the point here? If you have a full composed cosmology, you cannot really prove it wrong. We can cross out witches and say God's will. God did it. God made it sunny today. God made it rainy today. God made me not lose my attention, or the devil made me lose my attention. God didn't help me. Okay? If you want to go that way. Or we could say fate. Fate did this. Fate did this. My fate was not to study hard. I was fated never to succeed in life. What's this all about? We're giving an account of misfortune, of why it doesn't happen. You're going along on a highway and you smash into a pole. Everyone's dead in the car but you. If you're a religious person, you might say, it's a miracle you survived. Everyone should have been dead. You should have been. Everyone died except you. It was a miracle. If you don't believe in religion, you say, boy, was I lucky. In the random numbers of life, somehow I popped in. If you were a Zanta, you would say, the witches didn't want to kill you. Okay? Let's go back. If you look at types of thinking, there's three types. There's rational, irrational, and non-rational. Rational is what? When you use the best means to the end. If I said, what's the quickest way to get to L.A., you would not give me directions to Salt Lake. Right? Irrational is when you use the incorrect mean to get to a desired end. I want to get to L.A., you give me directions to Reno. Okay? Now, you could be mistaken, and therefore it wouldn't be irrational, be misinformed. But if you said, no, I really know that going to Reno, and then after you get to Reno, go to San Francisco, then San Francisco to L.A., and that's the quickest way, not the most scenic, the quickest way, you would say that's ignorant, that's irrational. If I said there's a fire in the room, how's the best way to get out, you would not say, let's build a door. All right? You would just go through the door. To start building a door which would get you out would be kind of stupid since there's a fire and you want to get out quickly. Now, all comedy, from the Marx Brothers to Charlie Chaplin to present day Dumber and Dumbest, is based on the notion of everyone in the film being rational, using the right means to the end, but the comics being irrational, that is, using odd means to an end. And it becomes so hysterical to see this. All right? My favorite is Marx Brothers is Captain Spaulding, where he looks for the jewelry and he says, let's build everyone in the house next door, and they take out a map trying to build this. Right? But all comedy's based on that. Non-rational, that's where I want to go now. All value systems are based on non-rational assumptions. All cosmologies are based on non-rational assumptions. What's non-rational? It can be neither proven or disproven. It's a value assumption. Okay? Rational's best means. Irrational is worse means. Okay? Non-rational is not about means, it's just about fundamental assumptions. If you believe the whole world was created by God, it can neither be proven or disproven. It's an article of faith. If you believe the witches control everything, then it is a non-rational assumption. Most really big debates are not about rational, irrational, but really about non-rational, which is why they never get over, because you're starting with two assumptions that can be neither proven or disproven. Okay? Good. And as we noted, luck, miracles, faith, and witches are all based on a kind of a cosmological understanding of what's causing a good fortune or bad fortune. Let's go a little bit more into misfortune by evil. In South America, if people die, people go to the shaman and want to find out why. Shaman is a religious healer who is supposed to, by his very nature, to see things, to have a visionary in terms of how this works. But there's a problem. People sometimes think the shaman could be evil. So he might have caused my son to die. He said he came here to heal, but maybe he didn't. So the shaman's in a predicament. He goes to heal, he's going to be paid. He tries his best, but if the person doesn't heal and dies, the family could think maybe the shaman didn't do his best. Maybe he really wanted to kill him. So, and if they decide that this guy did his best, it's not the shaman's fault, my son was murdered by someone else. They want to know, was it in the village? Whereabouts? And the shaman knows that if he accuses someone, the family will kill that person. And he also knows if that family kills that person's relatives will know it's because the shaman said that was the person who did it, and they will come looking for the shaman maybe. What a peckle of fish, right? What are you going to do? In this one particular case, the person died and the shaman just kept on saying, I got cloudy images, I got cloudy images. And then he heard that there was a village boy who had grew up and went to the city of Lima. He had come back to the general area. It was like 25 miles away, which is long in terms of walking distance. And he also knew he had very few relatives in the village. 25 miles away, few relatives. He now went to the family who lost the son and said, I now know the man who did it. This city gentleman, and everyone knows in the city you engage in all this stuff. And the family thanked him, and several days later, that gentleman was killed. Okay. Problem with the shaman, you're looking at evil, nothing causes by accident. You want to pay back people who hurt you. There's intermediate people in terms of the shaman. I'm going to talk more about the shaman coming up, but let's go on still with evil. Sociologists in looking at evil say there's a relationship between social structure and the belief in witches. That if you look in the 16th century when they had the great witch burning trials, you found something very interesting. Most of the people being accused were women, and they were women with a little bit of property, not incredibly wealthy. Why? Why do they stay away from the incredibly wealthy? Right, they could buy allies. But the people, why not the poor of the poor, but people had a little bit of stuff? Well, they didn't have much allies, and the church said if you could prove that you were a witch, you got the property. So there was a financial agreement, or not agreement, but incentive, if you will, to find witches, and that they did. Let's go to America. Witchcraft in America is very interesting because, and here's the point, write this down, the people who you tend to think are causes of evil are usually socially marginal people. Now, what constitutes social marginalness changes with times. With times. Sometimes one group's marginal, sometimes that group becomes center. Sometimes people are center and then they become marginal. But get this, we think with society. Remember Durkheim, sacred thing, we cherish values. We think more with our society than we realize. And people's position in that society affects our evaluation of them. Okay? So if you do not have many friends, if you're more on the marginal side out, you could be suspected of being guilty of witchcraft. Okay. Let me give more specific. Take your department. Take your business. Who do you look at as being a little odd? Is that person that's very friendly, or is the person that people don't want to talk to? Is it a person who just arrived, or is it a person maybe that's been there a long time but just stays to themselves? And don't you talk about them in certain ways. You see, their marginality allows you to wonder about them. And if something bad happens in your office or something, would you think maybe they could be responsible? Again, you're thinking with marginality. I'll return to that in a minute. Let's go to America. As most of you know, the Salem witchcraft trials was America's big high point of witchcraft hangings. America did not kill witches the way the European countries did. And therefore, people have studied Salem witchcraft for a long time, and they noted something very interesting. They noted that if social marginality was a critical factor in accounting for witchcraft, do we see it in Salem? And the answer is yes. What happens in Salem? Salem was in the 1690s, 1650s or 40s, it was the major port on the East Coast, much more important than Boston. By the late 17th century, 1690s, Boston has replaced Salem. Better harbor, people are moving down. The once prosperous town of Salem has now become more marginal. Okay, people are more depressed. The future looks bleak. They would say of Salem the same thing they will say about Philadelphia in the year 2000. Its best days were behind it. Okay. And this created an incredible sense of gloom. People were experiencing a collective misfortune. They wanted to know why. In this climate, teenage girls had visions of witches. people immediately jumped on it. In many ways, the teenage girls were addressing, if you will, a world of moral panic. The social order was changing. People knew it. They didn't know really why. If these girls would have been around 40 years earlier, they would have dismissed them as kind of like silly girls and no big deal. But in this new sociological climate of shifting of the future, of moving out, they listened because it kind of like spoke to their own gloom in a way. It gave them an explanation of misfortune. That's A. But then who do the girls accuse? Do they accuse the mayor of the town? Do they accuse the minister? Mm-mm. The first people they accuse are really the person who lives on the edge of town, the widower who never remarried, the guy who only comes rarely to church and everybody says is cranky. You see the point? They're going for, even in the community, those who are more outsiders, if you will, more sociologically marginal. And of course, their sociological marginality makes it plausible for the town. Oh yeah, I always thought that person was. So we have two things here. The intellectual plausibility of the argument comes about because A, people did believe there were witches, that the girls didn't create that. That was just part of the general fabric of 17th century thought. But what created it also was the changing larger macroclimate of the transformation of Salem from a vibrant town to a small podunk town. Then the girls coming in gave voice to that, and then by picking on the most marginal of that group, it allowed other people to key on that. Do you know how it ended, the Salem witchcraft trials? They kept on saying the girls, name names, until they named the governor of the Massachusetts territory. Remember, there wasn't any states then. And when they confronted the governor, very apologetic, but said, you know, the girls think your wife could be a witch. You know what he said? Let us remember, these are just children. The witchcraft trials were over. When you go after the elite, the allies, the position, they were able to redefine the reality. But it's wonderful to us because witchcraft is a belief, is a looking for evil agents and an explanation for causes of misfortune. It'd be very interesting, and I have no data on this, but with the Nevada Power and our electrical bill going up, how many people look at Nevada Power as evil? Okay. Not incompetent, not people making a tough decision by California market, which in some ways is much more responsible for the reckless growth without building power plants that just threw off the whole grid, okay? Or not Enron, which entered in managing and changing the financial distribution in some ways, right? But we look at Nevada Power as evil. And so almost to the point, in watching this, they've had to come forward and says, we're not evil, we're not making a profit, we're doing this, you know, and that sort of thing. But my point is, it's a misfortune. People's power bills jumped 100%, and they want to know why. And what's loomis on the Nevada thing, which fits the Salem position, is the notion that this is just not 2 years, then we go back to the cheap energy, but we might be getting every year a little bit more, and we're moving into this uncertain time, and it's really taking a big bite. And out of this thing, we want to know why. Now, knowing why is to be human, but notice how we're personifying. In ways, we're anthropomorphizing Nevada Power, which is the company, but we're not even knowing people's name, but Nevada Power has this force, and it's moving for its selfish disadvantages and moving it on that. This in no way justifies a thing that very much could be a type of business, poor business practices here, but I'm not concerned with that at this point. I want to concern with the average Nevadan. Personifying Nevada Power is evil is exactly what took place in Salem. It's also a wonderful sense of anthropomorphizing. There's not accidental things. There's not people making decisions that turned out to be bad with good intentions having terrible consequences. That's impossible. The world is orderly, and when good things don't happen, it's because evil intervened. I know you're not Christian, but isn't this an incredibly Christian view? Okay? Good. Let's go on. There's another one, and I throw this in my 101 class, and I'll do it here just because it's fun. People have wondered, given the social marginalization thesis, which kind of makes sense in a broad sense, people thought, well, why 1696 or 7 when this broke out? Why not some other year? It was bad for a decade or so. Why not? And one person thought, in addition to the social marginalization of the city that created intellectual plausibility, was the notion of seasonal change in nutrition and ergot poisoning. And he went back and looked at that spring when all the accusations broke out, and he looked at it. It was incredibly wet that spring. You might think, what does that have to do with anything? Well, people made their own rye bread. The rye took slower to raise. Funguses got on the rye bread. People just baked it in because they didn't have any germ theory. They didn't scrape it off, just baked it in and ate it. All right, no big deal. He wanted to know what was the chemical composition of that fungus, and to his surprise, it had all the chemical properties of LSD. And so his position was, in a very interesting article, is that the reason there was so much witchcraft accusation is because the whole town was tripping. And they actually did say witches. All right, good. Let's go on to present-day witches and the Wicca, which is a kind of a Stone Age religion. They call themselves neo-pagans, okay, before the new pagans, all right? And it's kind of a combination of Christianity and non-Christian ideals. It's very interesting. In the 16th century, if you said you were a witch, you were burnt at the stake. In the 21st century, if you say you're a witch, you're invited to a party. Okay? We no longer have We're still looking for notions of misfortune and personifying evil, but we no longer look at witches in and of themselves as the source of evil in this day and age, though we do look at other people as the source of evil. That being said, what is Wicca? Wicca believed that that the essence of religion was kind of a nature religion. In some ways, they talked themselves to the Druids, the Celtic people, and they thought that by engaging in this ecological connection of nature, the sun, the moon, the stars, that you had a more holistic religion. There are, and I wouldn't be surprised if there are people in this class taking this class. Every time when I teach it live, there's always one or two people who are witches, who do, in terms of the full moon, do certain spells or whatever. They will be quickly to point out that they're good witches, kind of like Dorothy, the wicked witch of the East and the good, nice witch of the West. And they try to do good things. So that's the difference. It's interesting that most people who belong to Wicca are urban educated. It's not really a rural thing. They might be into nature, but they're not from the rural area. They live mostly in the east or the south, and a lot, which won't surprise you, in California, is about 61% are heterosexual and 28% are bisexual, which is interesting. So you kind of really are having kind of a yuppie thing, in a sense. You're having college-educated or quasi-college educated urbanites disenchanted with the religion they were raised in, which would probably be some variation of Christianity, and looking at some other religion that emphasizes the mother goddess and man and creates covenants of coming together in community. I only bring it up. There's been some interesting books written on it, and it's kind of fun and very informative. Point is that today witches are not seen by American culture as the purveyors of evil. Other forces are, but in other cultures, witches still are seen as the source of evil, the sources of misfortune. Let's go on to the notion of shamans before we go to speaking of the devil. Shaman. We used to think that all cultures had shamans, and shamans all had certain qualities in common. More sustained research in lots of parts of the world find out what we call shamans varies by each locality. Still, there are some remarkable continuities that pass through in a shaman. What is one? Shaman is a belief that a person has the ability to leave their body and go into another world to find out what's going on. What else? Shamans believe that the cosmology, in some sense, is found with like a sacred pole or a tree that you move up. It generally has animal helpers, and it's for fully developed Siberian sense. But here's the essence: is that a shaman tries to figure out the cause of misfortune, particularly illness. And remember, they don't believe in germs. Germ theory did not exist. So if you were ill, it's because a part of your soul was taken over by a malevolent spirit. The shaman would go through this process and then discover what was going on and come back and heal you. Some people have looked at the healing techniques of a shaman and compared them with a psychiatrist and said there's some remarkable continuity between a shaman and a psychiatrist. That a psychiatrist gives comfort in several ways. Besides guiding you through to understand a problem, they do several things. They name an illness. Okay, you're suffering from bipolar depression. Okay, you go, wow, okay, is it serious? Right? And then he says, I can treat you with these pharmaceutical drugs. Okay, and these are some of these are genetic, some of these are brand new. So it heightens expectations, right? And then giving to you. So you have the chemical drugs that can help, but it also alleviates anxiety by naming the illness. And now you kind of know what you're facing. It then prescribes stuff that is going to help you. So it has kind of almost a placebo effect in some cases. Shamans do the same thing. What's happening? Talak has taken your soul. Oh, what can we do? I can get it back. We need to do this, this, and this. So you heighten expectations. You bring the whole family in, thereby reaffirming, kind of ritualistic. You bring everyone in, reinforcing the bonds, right? And then you're able to heal. If you look at most healing, 80% of most illnesses will heal themselves naturally. So most shamanistic activity, regardless of what it does, will do some healing. And we now know with the placebo effect, if you can rise anticipations with the mind can heal. Which is why doctors never want to tell you it's hopeless, right? They can just say, see better, but we can get it. There's help. We have treatment. They want to keep this notion that it can get better. There is a way out, okay? How many times have you ever heard a doctor saying, this is the worst case of cancer I've ever seen? And fact of the matter is, anyone who had this is dead in 12 days, right? Did you ever hear someone talk that way to the patient? No. Because they want to keep the possibility of the placebo effect there. There was a Hollywood producer named Norman Cousins who was diagnosed with terminal cancer and given a couple months to live. And so he decided that if I have to die, I'm going to go out of this world laughing. And so he used all of his connections to bring in all the copies of the Marx Brothers and I Love Lucy's, and he just watched comedy. He didn't want to watch anything serious, just comedy. And he chuckled through the day as he watched all these different comedies. And then a couple months went by, and his cancer went into remission. True story. Sometimes it happens, right? Cousins wondered, was it just accident? Right? Witches? God help me? Luck. He thought, did I do something myself? Did I do something by having so much humor in my life that helped my body defend itself against this disease? Right? And he thought it did. And he wrote a book about the importance of laughter in maintaining health. Now, since then, we do know that humor is incredibly important to maintaining health. In fact, some people argue that a laugh a day keeps the doctor away. Okay? So remember that. That's why you should always listen to 97.1 when they give you that one little 30-second joke every hour on the hour. Last part about shamans I want to end is I want to point out that Jack and the Beanstalk is a kind of shaman, kind of a reluctant shaman. Remember that story of Jack and the Beanstalk. The harp is playing, the rivers are flowing, it's all wonderful. The giant jumps down, steals the harp, disaster hits. Okay, Jack gets some beans, he throws it in, the vine comes up. I would say to you that vine is not just a vine, but a sacred celestial pole that's cutting through the cosmos. Jack leaves this world going into the next world, and with the help of an animal helper, a chicken, that warns him the giant is coming, Jack is able to take something that his world has lost, the golden harp that brought bounty to the land, and return it to the land. Just like a shaman returns the soul to the person, and just like me telling the story this way to you, I return something that you too have lost. Right? Now, hopping on, because we don't have much time, I want to hit to the last thing on terms of evil, and it is important, is the notion of contemporary evil accusations that really have to do with child abuse. And there is a wonderful book written by Joan Fontana, as a British social anthropologist, and she calls Speak of the Devil. And what really struck her was in the 1980s, the remarkable cases of sexual abuse charges that were leveled against males and female preschool teachers in England and in the United States. And what really struck her after all these mountains and mountains of investigations, how these charges resembled 16th century witchcraft accusations. Okay? And she said this needs to be studied. Why do we find in the 1980s, in the late 20th century, why do we find so much commonality to the 16th century? And being a sociologist, she also wrote a book on 16th century witchcraft and belief, so she was sensitive to this. She went off doing her research. And in her research, to sum it up right to the end, and then we'll take it apart, was she found that all of these child abuse cases that linked devil or satanic worship, there was no proof. None. Not in any of the 20-odd cases in England, not any in the 20-odd or 13-odd cases in America. None. Now, she's very careful to say, is there child abuse in England and America? Yes. But in these specific cases that link child abuse to satanic worship, there was no data. And yet this was reported in the papers, psychiatrists came in and everything on this and really fabricated, if you will, these incredible things. Now, if you see it once, you could say, how odd, like Salem. But if you see it cross a whole country, at a particular time, as a sociologist, you really want to know what is going on to make this plausible. Remember, and if it was 1630 and the girls said, we see witches, in vibrant Salem, everyone would laugh and go, yeah, I see witches too, let's go into our life. Right? The collapsing of the Salem economy made people really upset about the future. We live our lives in the future. Right? And when it looks gleam, we want to try to explain misfortune. So she's saying, is the same thing going on in the 16th century that we're going here? And she has a nice thing. She says, why the epidemic of allegations? Why the epidemic? And she comes to the notion that at the turn of the 20th century, that there's a time of incredible moral ambiguity. That people living in England and in America are the values that they were reared in. They do no longer see those being transformed in the way they thought they were. There's a greater sense of choice. It's maybe more cosmopolitan. Hey, you can do this, you can do that, you can do this. And all this leads to a certain sense of uncertainty. And then, critical, and let me look here because I just, in preparing for this, I looked at this the other day. You see it linked to sex. And you see, what's really interesting about witchcraft is it's always in some ways linked, not just to misfortune, but linked in some ways to sexual practices. And you see that in every society, the regulation of sexuality is fundamental to that society. Witches are an embodiment of antisocial evil. They do things. They have sex with dogs. Right? They fornicate with the devil. Right? This is not normal behavior. They have sex with children. Okay? This is clearly unacceptable. And it's interesting, the strength of Christianity, Christian imagery, she argues accounts for why this continues all the way down from the 16th century, why it shared some of things. What were some of the things that it shared? That people witches would fly on broomsticks at night. There would be orgies taking place. There would be the drinking of urine and eating of feces. Okay, all these stuff that's what? To make you an animalistic, a bestiality. Clearly not human. And these were part of the things that these children were asked to talk on where they reported. Now, you all know 5, 4, and 6-year-olds want to please. They just simply want to please adults. It's just the way they are in any culture. And you also know if they sense that the adult, once they hear this, they're going to go with the story, right? It's kind of like they think that's where they should go. It's part of the way you learn. So children at that young age become incredibly unreliable in terms of actually seeing stuff, particularly when you interview a whole lot and they're contradicting one another. Okay? But if you have adults who really believe that this possibly could take place, and you start saying, and were there dogs present, and did they do things to the dog? Oh yes, they did things. You see how this goes in terms of it? And it's only in retrospect people realize that a lot of these were just incredibly leading. Okay? So again, the point. And all these accusations, there's no data at all that it was ever linked to witchcraft and satanic belief. Why do we believe in it? It threatens social values. Okay? It's kind of like a moral panic is her position. That we are moral creatures, and in times of social transformation, the world that it's orderly and how we would like to make sense of it doesn't seem to hold. And for some people, they need to have these borders. They need to reinforce it, reassert it. All right, and so it's a provocative book and study, and it's really very, very interesting. I think what's really critical here is that children are seen as a vital part of any society. To attack a child is to attack that society. To protect a child is to protect that society. All right? So we have children which are more sensitive. They're being victims. In this case, the children themselves are not suffering, but people think the children are suffering and they want to protect it. And so off we go to defend it. In most cultures, gossip is about moral values. There's an everyday life gossip. Hey, did new street lights come in? Hey, did you see the flood on the radio? Did you see this? There's another gossip, and that's what you all engage in. It's a gossip of talking about how and who did what, who's sleeping with who's divorcing whom, who's going to do this or that. And what these really are about is maintaining moral values. Is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? Is it a really, really bad thing or not so bad thing? Men and women all gossip in this way. Men and women all are gauging in these moral dimensions. That is why when there's transformations in the social order, we can have this, quote, moral panic. I want to make a provocative point, and I want you to think on this. In the late 21st century, really in the 1990s, there was an epidemic of sexual harassment charges being made. Did you know that last year, every month in the state of California, 40,000 a month by various companies, there's somebody complaining about something of what? Okay. Now, we either have two things going on here. Either this behavior is actually taking place and everybody is just simply out of control and there's the defenses versus the other, or we have people rereading situations, rereading definitions. And the point I want to make here, if you look at this as a sociological, most people engage in this discussion moralistically. Is this good or bad? We got to protect the unborn. We have to protect the innocent. We have to protect the vulnerable. Right? But notice who is being protected in all of this. More often than not, it's women. And more often than not, it's young women. And more often than not, the young women are being defined as children. Notice the analogy here in terms of the Fontaine study. Okay. What you really are seeing here is the protection of women in a certain role. And what I want to address here is not the question of stalking, which there are laws on the book about stalking and rape and that sort of thing, and actual, if you will, just brutal crimes. I want to talk about the notion of discussions, of words. Why is it terrible when we see people in classrooms, say, and they're talking about sexual issues? Why is that person being accused of engaging in sexual harassment? Why is that person, in a way, being accused of being a moral pervert? I would put it to you, and I'm only looking here and addressing the interesting question of discussions in the presence of ladies. And that's my point and my word choice here. It's no longer just a student. It's the presence of a female student. And the idea of talking sex in front of a female student is defined in so many ways as being improper. Why? In many ways what it is, it's looking at upholding a certain value, that this could be seen as somehow risque to this person. And in other ways it is seen as perhaps insulting. Okay. Again, my point here is I want to critique why the rush of all these cases in the 1990s, where you found none of it in 1980s, and I'm addressing myself only to conversations in the classroom, where why was this all permissible in the 80s and not the 90s? And to wrap up real quick here, I would put it to you that what America's going in the late 20th and early 21st century is a cultural conservatism. What that means is that there was an experiment in America called the hippie movement that did something interesting. It opened up to the notion that the gender roles, that men and women were separate, they all argued they were equal. And if they were equal, then they should talk about sex in the same way. You should not make a distinction. There's a lady press and change the topic, which was really what what the people did in the 50s and 60s. It was deemed by women in the 60s as insulting and as inequality. What they argued for was to open this up. And also what the thing is, there was a heightened sense that sexuality was important. Sexuality was natural. It was very in the 60s, if you taught college, to talk about sexuality, and if people really had problems with it, that was their problem, because sexual was normal and the culture was uptight. Isn't it interesting, by the 1990s, American culture is more open sexually than any time in the history of this nation. Any time. Isn't it interesting that the academic community, in terms of its relationship with the dominant culture, is more conservative than it's been in the last 20 years? Why? What has happened here is two ways. Part of the moral panic is merely the moral panic of people working in the institution, where they have defined themselves in some sense as opposition to the mainstream societies. If mainstream society was sexually uptight, then it was liberating to talk about sex. When mainstream society does no longer become uptight, then it becomes a way of showing one's own moral superiority by not talking about that which is common and embraces within the culture. Okay? You follow the argument I'm making? So what constitutes a moral panic? What constitutes whether this is appropriate or inappropriate is not at the essence of the thing, but really the definition of people's relationship to one another. And I'm arguing what we have is remarkable here is the female is used as a symbol by which people make a statement of their virtueness or their lack of virtueness. And that, in some sense, continues in many ways, is a Victorian notion of the female that continues in a different way, although it's couched in a very different way. And, very interesting, to sell that argument, we take that and we reduce it to children, because children need protection, and in doing that we celebrate the whole here. Okay? So this is kind of controversial in my position, but I would like you to look at this in terms of a sociological critique of the spread of these accusations in certain ways. And we have this wonderful sense of seeing us then is that misfortune needs to be marked, and we do it by losing society and thinking with society, and particularly with different gender categories within that society. And so I thank you.
If you are interested in this or any other UNLV distance education course, please call us at 702-895-0334.